Welcome to the Benson Wealth Podcast. I take complex financial and economic topics and make it accessible to the everyday listener. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Benson Wealth Podcast. My name is Drew Benson. I'm the president and founder of Benson Wealth Management and a senior wealth advisor with Raymond James. I'm also the co-managing partner for True North Wealth Management Group, which is a platform for independent wealth advisors. I'm a formally trained macroeconomist and a current certified financial planner and wealth advisor. So today I'm here again with an associate in my practice, Patrick Shea. Pat, great to see you again.
Drew, thanks for having me on.
So this is part two of our whole series on the Great Recession, on the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. And today we're going to talk about Too Big to Fail. So we're going to talk about a couple things. One is we're going to talk about the movie itself, Too Big to Fail. And then I did read this big beast, the book Too Big to Fail. And the book was actually, the movie, I should say, was actually pretty accurate to the book, except for a couple small things. And so I really want to hash out the concept of Too Big to Fail with you today. So we'll first talk about the movie and the events. I think it's helpful if you're going to understand the financial crisis. I think you need to understand the bailout measures, and you need to understand the nature of the financial institutions that failed. And then at the end of this episode, I'd like for us to hash out, should they have done the bailouts, what are the repercussions of the bailouts, etc. So let's take 30, 40 minutes and talk a little bit about the book and the movie. So you watched the movie, Pat. What was your thought of the movie, just preliminarily?
I enjoyed it a lot. It was definitely interesting. It was great to go from The Big Short and Margin Call to Too Big to Fail. You know, you sort of had another large missing piece of the story in the greater context of the financial crisis. So I really appreciated seeing, you know, the government's interaction with the issue, and then seeing the banks interact with the government as well. That was great. And then even from a theoretical perspective, you know, the questions that you brought up, should they have bailed them out? Should they not have bailed them out? And then really being able to see the banks themselves in the greater context of the American economy. When they brought up that phone call with GE, that was really helpful to flesh out the gravity and the extent of the whole situation.
Yeah, it was systemic in nature. So right. It was spreading far beyond even just investment banks. It was hitting commercial banks, and then it was hitting even bigger firms, which were bigger companies, which we'll touch on today.
Yeah.
All right. What was your thought on the opening? I will say this about the opening. So when the movie starts, Too Big to Fail, there's a bit of an explanation. It's like a montage of events of presidents from the past. Talk about how the movie opens. By the way, that did not happen in the book. The book opens pretty much with Jamie Dimon and Dick Fuld of Lehman Brothers. But why don't you talk about the opening for a second?
Right. That was the question that I had for you before we started, was how the two matched up, right? Because I was a little wary of the opening, where you had all these, you know, TV clips from the different politicians signing in deregulation, which is an often, well, I don't know how often cited, but so it sort of primed the pump for us to see this as an issue of deregulation, right? All this happened because there wasn't regulation. And that was somewhat recurring, as, you know, the Hank Paulson's PR lady was like, well, how are we going to respond to why wasn't this regulated in the first place? And so, yeah, I am curious to know what your thoughts on how accurate that is, and how fair is that to the viewer in many ways, to sort of like hit you with that sort of confirmation bias, if you want to.
Sure. No. Yep.
Or anchoring bias. I can't remember exactly which one it is, but
yeah, I think you're right about the anchoring bias. My big frustration with pretty much all of the Wall Street movies that try to portray events like 2008 and 9 is that they create a basic narrative that it was the lack of congressional oversight and a lack of regulation that led to these crises, and that everyone got really greedy, and there was far too many laws or acts that were basically eradicated. And because we got rid of these safety measures, that is like the source of the reason. That's the ultimate cause of why we hit the financial crisis. I've always felt that really to be a frustrating and an inadequate explanation of what actually happened. It's super surface level. And the reason I feel that way is that historically, we haven't seen these level of financial crises. And I'm going to talk about this when I interview Charles Calamiris here in about a month. We're going to talk about the fact that there have been plenty of other instances in global history where we haven't seen the magnitude and severity of financial crises, and it's much, much deeper than just the fact that we deregulated. Now, to be fair, by the way, I do think deregulation played a part, but that would be sort of a secondary or proximate cause, not the ultimate cause. And so I remember in my first job when I worked at an economic consulting firm, I worked with this economist, Jim, who's a really brilliant man, one of the smartest people I've actually had the pleasure of working with. And I remember we were talking about the financial crisis because I actually started at the firm in 2010. And Jim and I started talking about the concept of moral hazard and deregulation. And he made a point to me that has always stuck with me. He's like, look, you can't live in an economy with deregulation if you have a precedence of moral hazard. And moral hazard is basically just taking away the safety net of people making bad decisions. A great example is in American football. There's significantly more head injuries. Right? There's more head injuries because of the false perception of safety of wearing a helmet when you compare it to rugby. Because with rugby, they're not wearing helmets, yet they don't have near to the extent of the head trauma that you would think. And that's because they know they don't have a helmet on, and when they tackle in rugby, they know they need to protect their head. You know, I played football in high school. I remember getting speared. I was a running back my senior year, and I remember kids coming in and spearing me, you know, head on with their helmet. And I remember getting concussions playing football. And I think we all had this false perception of safety. And so when you take the downside effects away, that is what is known as moral hazard. It's the same of like when someone has a rebellious child and the parents continue to bail them out of prison or bail them out of their bad situation and they never reap the consequences, they're going to continue to behave poorly, right? And so this is really what was happening with the banking system. And something that none of these movies really ever seem to touch on is in the late 90s, there was a hedge fund called Long-Term Cap Management, which I think we referenced on a prior episode. And when Long-Term Cap Management failed, it was a hedge fund that had been betting on the Russian ruble. And then when they bet the wrong direction and their whole hedge fund blew up, they had funding from most of the major banks on Wall Street. And those banks were terribly exposed. And the Fed secretly sort of intervened and bailed out long-term cap management and basically wiped away the risk to the financial industry. And many academic scholars have cited that as a major reason of basically a green light to the financial industry that you can go ahead and act in a morally hazardous way. And so the other major law that occurred was around the same time, they got rid of something known as Glass-Steagall. And Glass-Steagall prevented commercial banks and investment banks from basically commingling assets. So when you deregulate Glass-Steagall, which in theory I'm fully in support of deregulating something like Glass-Steagall, but the problem with deregulating something like Glass-Steagall, which can introduce additional risks to the system, is you can't do it, back to my former colleague Jim, you can't do it in an environment where you have moral hazard. And those are and then, by the way, there's so many other parts to the crisis that I'm going to get into in this series, but those are the things that are completely missed in those little montages before movies that I find really, frankly, anti-intellectual and lacking any sort of academic teeth at all. And it's a nice narrative, right? Like that sells so well to the public of everyone got really greedy and these jerk bankers took advantage of all of us. Much of that may be true. Many of them did get greedy. Many of them did made reckless decisions. And part of that was due to the fact that we deregulated. But there's so much more to the story that is missed in the whole process that is frustrating for me. And that's actually when I've watched some of these movies about Wall Street and about the financial crisis, it's what's motivated me to want to do a series like this, because I want the average person out there to understand that, like any story, there's always a few more plot lines that have to be understood if you really want to be smart about what happened during the crisis, so that we as a country, and those of us that actually work in finance or on Wall Street, those of us moving forward can actually learn the proper lessons from the crisis so that we don't repeat the mistakes in the future. And I think right now, the general sense is like, well, let's just ramp up regulation and we're going to solve our problems.
Right.
That's not going to fix our problems. It's going to create new problems.
Yeah.
One other quick thing I wanted to point out too is, and this is pointed out in Charles Calomiris' book, which again I'm going to interview him, is that some nations struggled with over-regulating, and there was a lack of access to credit. So one of the issues with over-regulation, or with even a monopolized banking system like in England, the Bank of England, for much of its history, essentially had a bit of a monopoly on the banking system. And there was a lack of access to credit. And their neighbors up north, Scotland, actually had a much more open, less regulated banking system. And what happened in Scotland is they had incredible growth in their capitalist system. Businesses were burgeoning and growing. And so in that instance, the problem with regulation is that if it goes too far, there's not enough credit for a country to actually grow and expand, and businesses can't be productive. What happened during the financial crisis, though, is that there was way too much excess credit. And that's something else that Calomiris and other scholars have pointed out, is there is a balancing act where we need to have a financial system where businesses have access to credit, but we also need a financial system where there isn't an excess amount of credit, which can lead to these incredible financial blowups.
Right. And I think, hitting that balance is kind of, that comes up in the movie indirectly insofar as they keep talking about like the credit markets are frozen and we need to get lending happening again, right? So the excess of credit eventually led to no credit at all because no one was capable of lending because everyone was going into default. And I think seeing the banks as that linchpin between all of because they're financing all of these other companies, right? That's their business. They're in the business of lending money. But then if the lenders are going out of business, then everything else starts falling like dominoes.
And that was one of the things, and this happened in the movie, where Ben Bernanke, the Fed chair, points out that during the Depression, there was a lack of access to credit. And that was one of, yes, we had the stock market crash in 29, but one of the reasons that the Depression was so deep and severe, there were multiple factors, but one of the factors was then there was no access to credit or little access to credit, which basically completely shutters the private sector and businesses. Yeah. And so there's this balancing act, and you can feel this tension throughout the whole movie between all those breakfasts with Paulson and with Bernanke. And Bernanke's like, Paulson comes in all stressed out, and Bernanke's like, there's a reason why I eat oatmeal in these meetings. It's the only way I can get anything down. So let's just talk about the movie and sort of the storyline of the book more broadly. The book spends a lot of its attention really around, and the book was by Andrew Ross Sorkin. And by the way, I thought he did a really brilliant job of just explaining the story. He kind of kept his opinion largely out of it. And so kudos to Sorkin for writing a pretty prolific book and for helping us understand the inside dynamic. With The Big Short, we got to see a lot of the players on the periphery that were shorting. Right. This is the inside. These are the back rooms. This is where the deals happen. This is where the big dogs are playing. And so these were the smoke-filled rooms. Yeah. And so I thought it was really fascinating to actually get into the psyche of all the major players. The first major player is Dick Fuld. So Dick Fuld is running Lehman Brothers. And, what was your thought, the way that Dick Fuld was portrayed in the movie? What was your kind of, take on him?
He was like grasping at straws because, he kept saying like we were at 66 in February, right? So his company was valued at $66 a share. And then with these assets, the real estate assets on his books, that as the real estate market declined, those assets became, toxic and started eating away at his capitalization. And he couldn't seem to like fathom the error that they'd made, which then and like that sort of hubris of like, no, we're worth 66 a share. I'm not taking anything less. That made him pass up on so many chances to be rescued by Warren Buffett, by Mitsubishi, by the Japanese, by B of A, by Bart. Like, so there's so many opportunities, but he couldn't get over the fact that they had messed up in such a way that he was now worth pennies on the dollar.
He fell into the trap, and I got the sense that when they were showing the other players, like the CEOs of Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, AIG, it seemed that most of the players understood the gravity of the toxic
Right.
assets.
Right.
And again, going back to our episode on The Big Short, the crux of this is that they had packaged mortgages in the form of mortgage-backed securities, and then collateralized debt obligations. All these firms had those real estate assets on their books, and something that I felt like everyone sort of acknowledged. Oh boy, we're in a big mess, except for Dick Fold.
Mm-hmm.
Like he kept saying over and over in the book, it came up like 100 times. These are still good assets.
Right.
And he kept saying real estate's going to come back. And there's that
Right.
scene in the beginning with his like PR woman. He kept saying it's going to come back, and he was telling his right hand man it's going to be going to be okay. And I think that was his fatal flaw. And this was referenced in the book. He just kept saying we've been through crises before. We're going to come out of this again, and we're going to gobble up other people. Mm-hmm. He actually believed that at the end of the crisis, he was actually going to be bigger, better, and stronger. What he didn't realize was the severity and the toxicity of the real estate assets.
Yeah.
And so going into the storyline, right? So let's kind of walk through it for a second. So at the very beginning, Warren Buffett offered to buy, basically, he wanted preferred shares. It was around $40 a share, which frankly seemed reasonable.
Yeah.
And then he wanted like a 9% dividend on it.
Right.
So that would have been hard for Lehman Brothers. But Warren Buffett comes up a lot in the book. Warren Buffett was a shrewd businessman, and he didn't love investment banks, and he had been burned by a deal with Salomon Brothers in the past. And so he remembered that. So here Dick Fold passes it up. And by the way, the other part of the story is that Hank Paulson, who's the Treasury Secretary, keeps trying to broker deals,
Right.
or assist in helping, because he knew if they already lost Bear Stearns, and they helped broker a deal with J.P. Morgan and helped backstop that deal. So that was the first bailout. What were they calling it in the movie over and over?
An assisted purchase.
Something ridiculous.
Like 4 large words to basically say bailout, and they're like, no, you can't say bailout. You
Yeah,
can't say bailout.
exactly. So he passes on Warren Buffett, and then these wasn't the next one was the Japanese, correct?
Mm-hmm.
In the book, they kind of flew back and forth, and then talk to us a little bit about kind of what happened with those negotiations.
Well, the Japanese also understood that the real estate was totally toxic.
Yep.
And so I think it was Mick Gabe who they had in there to replace the number 2 that they had to fire, and as part of a PR ploy, right? It was going well. They decided, like, so no one wants the real estate. We'll spin off the real estate.
They're going to create 2 companies, right?
Exactly, yes. Spin off the real estate to a separate entity that's not part of the deal. Because everyone realized this is trash, no one wants it, but there's still value left in the business. And that's understandable. There's other lines of business beyond mortgage-backed securities and the CDOs. So they decided we're going to spin that off, sell the good assets and the good lines of business to the Japanese. I don't know what their plan was for the real estate, but at least they were going to get some sort of, inflow of cash and start moving in the right direction. And then Dick Fold comes running in.
Well, they told Dick Fold, McGabe said, we're all set here.
Yeah, he's like, it's going well.
You stay in your office.
Yeah. And then Dick Fold ran in, heard that they were spinning off the real estate, grabs like the pitch deck or whatever and says like, no, like, let's look at these assets. I still think there's value here.
Yeah.
And the Japanese banker, he got up and said, like, no deal. And it has nothing to do with the assets, like just how it was conducted. Not gonna do it.
Yeah, he was pretty upset, and that's how it happened in the book. It basically was, this deal is done. Now there were a lot more interactions,
like kind of like outside of reality in many ways, and you kind of saw him frantically running around to Hank Paulson, to Warren Buffett, and responding erratically. And Dick Fold didn't seem to be kind of with it, on the same page as everyone else.
So then what happened is, and we'll get more into the meeting in a minute, but then. So Paulson, a lot of the storyline in the book is about Hank Paulson, and the movie, I would say, highlights Hank Paulson probably more than any other character.
Definitely.
Where I think the book was a little bit more even in its distribution. In fact, frankly, a lot of the book really centered around Dick Fold. But in the movie, it's more about Hank Paulson, which was fascinating. And Paulson's fear was that if Lehman Brothers goes, this is going to rip through the whole system. And then it's Merrill Lynch and it's Morgan Stanley. And then there's a whole AIG thing, which we'll talk about, and their exposure to collateralized debt obligations, which was mammoth. Then it was like, he had so much stress over, we can't let Lehman Brothers fail. However, he was hardline because I think at his core is this free market capitalist. He was hardline on not wanting to do bailouts.
Right.
He's like, no more bailouts. And he kept saying it in press conferences. So then we fast forward every deal that Dick Fold could have gotten but was a bonehead over. Then we fast forward, and in a panic, Timothy Geithner of the New York Fed and Hank Paulson of the Treasury decide to do a whole meeting and lock all these bankers essentially in a room, and they did. So they got all the people from like Morgan and Merrill and Goldman Sachs and others. They got them in a room, and they basically were like, I just remember the movie. Mm-hmm. Hank Paulson's like, this is your mess. You're all sort of culpable in this. You fix it. And so talk to us a little bit about that dynamic, and then Barclays and how that deal fell apart.
Right. So, they were all involved in the mortgage-backed securities. So, and he was also, not of the mind of bailouts. But one comment that he made was like, this Lehman Brothers is your trade partner in many instances, right? Like the guy on the other side of the phone doing repos, whatever it is that they're doing. Lehman Brothers is tied in with all of these other banks. They all trade with one another, and their businesses work because they have like counterparts that are able to do business between each other. So he was saying like, listen, like you're tied in with Lehman just as much as anyone else, and even more so. It's like Lehman falls, and I would like a little more clarification on why Merrill was so closely tied to Lehman. Maybe it was just the deal flow between the two. But yeah, he was sort of like saw them all as a group, and he's like, you guys are all connected, and Lehman goes down, that you're going to go down as well, and you've also been party to these toxic assets, so fix it. And I think a lot of that came from, as you're mentioning, like his hard line, no more bailouts.
Exactly.
And he was very willing to bend over backwards to sort of like try to get all the heads together in a room, and like you said, he locked them in the room. But
you're going to fix this mess. You created it. You fix it was basically his point. And we started this episode talking about moral hazard. He was very concerned about moral hazard. Paulson was.
Right.
And you could feel this, and it really came up in the book, this deep internal struggle of, I don't fundamentally believe in bailouts. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to do this. And I'm worried about the downstream effects of if we bail them out now we're creating another future mess by creating further moral hazard. So that was I think he so desperately wanted to save the system, but he so desperately didn't want to continue the moral hazard.
But then everything sort of fell through because, Barclays chat, no, and then they didn't close because their regulator shut the deal down. The regulators in England shut it down, which made me wonder, like, why didn't that happen in the U.S. like way back in the day about the mortgage-backed securities?
Yeah, and I think the regulators, they said there was like it took 30 days to notify the shareholders, right. and Paulson was basically pressuring them to just move around that. Yeah. And he's like, we can't agree to this deal. It's, by the way, Barclays was going to buy the healthy part of the business,
right?
And the same way that the Japanese were going to buy the healthy part of the business. And then in the storyline, right? There's that great scene where Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan sitting at the table, and he's like, I'll put in $1 billion, because they were basically, the rest of them were going to take the toxic assets. And he's like, I'll put in $1 billion. And then, Goldman Sachs is like, I'll put in $1 billion.
Yep. And
so they finally came to an agreement, but they needed someone to buy the good part of the business, which was Barclays. Barclays bailed. And by the way, and it came up in the book a bunch, not Dick Fold, Hank Paulson really was untrusting of the British. Mm-hmm. And he said, they're going to talk, and they're not going to do it. He's really worried about them not doing a deal. And his instincts were correct.
Right.
They didn't do the deal. The regulators shut it down, and the whole thing fell through.
And he was hoping on B of A, Bank of America.
That was the next move.
That was the next one.
And then what happened in the middle of all those meetings to Bank of America?
Merrill Lynch, seeing Lehman Brothers going down, knowing that they were next, was like, all right, well, if Lehman's not going to work with B of A, then maybe they'll work with me. Hops on the phone. They were in the same room, right? They're in like the little anteroom to the room that they were in, all meeting together. And he basically closes the deal and then goes in on the meeting about saving the company that he just screwed over by taking their deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was John Thane of Merrill Lynch, correct?
Right.
Yeah, and Paulson didn't like John Thane. He thought he was self-interested
Yeah.
and selfish. Um, Self-interest is not a big deal, but I think he just thought he was a really selfish guy and was really only looking out for his company as opposed to looking at the broader system, which really
Right.
made Paulson super frustrated. So then what happened? Lehman Brothers does actually fail, right? And so there's a whole weird scene with the SEC chairman who the book really portrayed him as being feckless and completely, he was not respected by anyone on the street.
Right. And there was that scene where they were telling him, like, if you don't tell Lehman Brothers to file for bankruptcy, then the markets are going to be really poorly affected by it. So I think what they were trying to do was get Lehman Brothers off the books, basically, like get them off the markets, off the exchanges, and they would do that effectively by having them file for bankruptcy. And
And
he
then other
wouldn't.
firms would acquire their assets.
Right. But he wasn't. He refused to like give Lehman Brothers directions, and then he eventually like called them up and said something that was basically told them to file for bankruptcy, but without actually saying it very confidently. And then Dick Fold was like, "Are you telling me to file for bankruptcy?" And he goes, "That's all I'm going to say. Have a good day." And hung
Yeah,
up.
right.
It's like,
And
okay.
and then they did, and there's this sort of sad. This is the one time I did feel bad for, and you do when you read the book, you feel bad
Yeah.
for a little bit for Dick Fold. Is he wasn't this horrible guy. He just really truly believed that what he was doing was the right thing, and that these real estate
Yeah.
assets would come back.
Yep.
Now, what happened later in the story is then there's the whole storyline. So pretty shortly after. By the way, one of the things that the movie didn't portray, but in the book, they literally were down to days. Right? So like with Lehman Brothers, like we have 48 hours and they're completely out of capital. And the same thing happened with AIG. The moment they dealt with Lehman Brothers, then it was like, now we got to move on to AIG. And AIG was a whale.
Right.
And that was because of their collateralized debt obligations. And then they were also writing these, this is why we talked about these complex instruments in the last episode, is then they were writing these credit default swaps.
Right. So
They were on the
all
hook for the swaps.
all the big banks were insuring their books as they should, but they were all doing it at AIG. So AIG was kind of holding the bag for all of these big banks with the toxic assets.
It's wild.
Not good.
Totally wild. So then remind me, AIG. So AIG essentially does get the bailout, right?
Yep.
And then just step back, Fannie and Freddie get bailed out.
Yeah, I think they were bailed out before.
Correct. They were bailed out before.
And that was more than a bailout. It seems like they became federal.
Yeah, they were basically acquired by the
institutions.
government.
Yeah.
They were basically pulled in-house. And that's another long story, which we don't have time for today. But that happened to create a sense of calm in the markets. And then when AIG was bailed out, Dick Fold was completely irate. So here they had bailed out Bear Stearns, and then they bailed out AIG.
But they let him fail.
But they let Lehman fail. Lehman was really truly the sacrificial lamb in this whole storyline.
Yeah.
And one of the questions I could ask is like, why? I asked this until I explored this more. Why Lehman Brothers? And I think we now kind of know the answer from reading the book and watching the movie. The bigger answer is that I think they were fed up with him. I think there's so many opportunities for them to take a deal, and they wouldn't take a deal. And Dick was stubborn, and he was naive to the true risk of these real estate assets. And I think he burned a lot of bridges, and I think there were plenty of people that were willing to let him go under.
Right.
Where there were others that I think had a little bit more favor with the government. I will say I sort of always believed that there were just these like special favors that they were doling out to their buddies. I don't, based on reading the book, think that's true anymore. I really think it came down to the fact that Dick Fold burned every bridge and any credibility, and everyone was done.
Yeah.
They were just done. And no one wanted to take on. The other part that came up, I think the guy's name was Flowers, he was the one that brokered he was a mergers and acquisitions attorney.
Right.
And I believe that was his name. It's like when they actually assessed the value of the books of Lehman, he was way overestimating the value of the real estate assets.
Right.
And there's a couple scenes where it's like, your real estate assets are worth half of what you're claiming. And that also made every suitor or potential buyer super nervous. They didn't want to get involved, where I think some of the other firms were a little bit more forthright on the level of toxicity of the assets.
Right.
Or how much toxic assets they actually had. So AIG gets funded. They created two firms, Maiden 2 and Maiden 3, MAIDEN. And that was essentially like the TARP program, where they were provided liquidity. So the Treasury and the Fed intervened and provided a backstop. And then you sort of fast forward towards the end of the book. By the way, all these different players either got private market funding. So Morgan Stanley got funding. I believe it was Chinese investors. So Morgan Stanley got private funding. Warren Buffett gave private funding to Goldman Sachs.
Right.
Everyone found a deal, or they got bailed out directly by the government, which would be AIG. But I do think AIG also got some private market funding as well. So everyone found funding, but it wasn't enough. And that's where you get to the end of the movie when we get into the whole TARP thing. So talk to us a little bit about the events of them trying to convince Congress to pass TARP.
Right. Well, I think the previous bailout happened without jurisdiction. Is that right?
Yeah, they just did it.
And so, but
They were claiming like emergency and exigent circumstances,
right,
some vague language that gave them the ability to go ahead. And there was the one. Sorry to interrupt you. There was the one guy that did what was it called? The break the glass.
Oh yeah,
that was the break the glass measure. And I'm going to think of his name in 2 minutes, but they were already thinking through what jurisdiction do they have. But then they realized, and I think this was because, to back up, Pat, this was because they got a little bit of pushback from Ben Bernanke, who was like, I don't know if we have the legal authority to do this. Right. We have to go to Congress, which is what then Paulson then starts pressuring Congress.
Right. And then they went to Congress with a 3-page bill, and Congress said it was too short.
Neil Kashkari.
Kashkari. Okay. He was on Paulson's team, is that right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay. He was an advisor to Paulson.
But yeah, but they came up with the TARP idea, which is Toxic Asset Repurchase Program.
Relief Program.
Relief Program, yeah, where they were going to essentially take an equity stake in these companies for, as long as it took to buy it back, where they could, provide capital to the banks. But the one area where they were pretty nervous about it was there were no restrictions on what they were to do with the proceeds from the equity sale to the Fed, right, or to the Treasury. So they were...
Sorry, we're dead wrong. Troubled Asset Relief Program.
Troubled Asset Relief.
Sorry.
Okay. Toxic would be a little...
I just always called it TARP, but I forget the acronyms.
Yeah.
Keep talking.
So then, they were worried, like, if we purchase an equity stake in these banks, give them effectively billions of dollars, are they actually going to spend it in the way we need them to spend it? Not on new compensation packages and a new office and things like that, but they needed it to fund their business lines of lending to smaller companies or just other companies that relied on them for day-to-day financing. So there was that, and towards the end of the movie, there was that little footnote of like, compensation rose to a record high in 2010, and companies continued to fail. So like I was curious, like, did they actually use the money in the way that the government wanted them to? But so they were worried that Congress wouldn't pass the bill because there were no restrictions on the money, and because it was a bailout of a magnitude that we had never seen before. And then the third piece to that was the bipartisan drama show, really, where Obama and McCain suspended their campaigns and went down to Washington, or was it New York?
It was Washington.
Washington, to get involved in the bailout program. And it seemed like both of them were vying for credit for, saving the economy right before an election. And well, that was the other. They were nervous that no one's going to approve a huge spending package right before an election because they all want to get reelected, right? And you don't want to be painted as, someone who's raising taxes to
bail out Wall Street bankers.
Yeah, exactly.
Billionaires.
Yeah. So it didn't pass the first go.
Yeah, it didn't make it through. A lot of Republicans decided not to support it.
Right.
And then they finally convinced, Paulson basically went and begged everyone.
Yeah.
finally convinced them, and then they pushed it through. And then that's where the program came about, where they were able to eventually purchase toxic assets and also just provide funding in general to these banks,
Yeah, but
right?
not before they had to convince the industry at large to take the money.
Yeah, so that's the next scene. I was just thinking of this. So then there's another scene where again they go to I believe it's the New York Fed all
Yep.
over again. They put everyone in a room. Timothy Geithner, the New York Fed chairman's there, and Ben Bernanke showed up to this one, and Hank Paulson's there. So there's the three major players, and they also brought in, and I'm forgetting her name right now, but the FDIC chairman
Right.
also came, and she was a force, by the way, and I know she was able to kind of ram through the pressure.
Well, because the threat was, if you don't, they're like, what happens if we don't? And they're like, well, we've got the chairman of the FDIC right here, and tomorrow you'll find out that you're not as well capitalized as you thought.
Yeah, they were
Which
going to
sounded
raise.
like they were just going to change the rules
Correct.
to basically put them in hot water.
What's a bit of a bullyish move, by the way.
Yeah.
Right. It's like you're going to take this, and if you don't, we're gonna raise your reserve requirements, which
Right.
means we're going to force you to have more capitalization. If you don't, then they could put you in receivership.
Yeah.
Which means you're going to fail.
Yeah.
So all these bankers are sitting at the table, right? So they bring all the usual suspects back, Merrill, Morgan, Citi, AIG, and then, although I don't know if AIG was actually at that one. I don't think they
Wells
were.
Fargo.
Wells Fargo was the newcomer, by the way,
Right.
because Wells Fargo was not involved in the original,
Right.
and he was pretty ticked off to be there.
Yeah, he's like, why, like, I'm not doing your fancy investment products over in New York. I'm from California, where like we don't need capital. Why should I take it?
Exactly.
But I think Paulson was trying to get everyone to rally around and realize like this is going to affect everyone, and frankly, you guys, like the head of the industry, it's your job to save it. And then I think the whole threat of the FDIC is what convinced Wells Fargo.
My understanding too is they wanted to give calm to the markets that everyone took capitalization.
Right, because if someone didn't, then that bank's fine. They don't need the money, which means everyone else is trash, and now
We're going to bail on all of them. So it was an all or nothing scenario.
Exactly.
Yeah, and the Wells Fargo guy was, he was furious.
Yeah.
In the end, they all took the money. They all got different amounts of money, but I think Wells got $25 billion.
Yep.
Eventually, it was repaid.
Right. So
Right.
that was the interesting thing to me. When you hear bailout, it sounds just like a free lunch. But
It wasn't.
it wasn't. It was an equity stake, so they were receiving a percentage of the bank's profits, and they were to be paid back. And I think most of the banks did pay it back.
And they took I think it was through preferred stock. It was non-voting preferred stock, and they had to pay back 5% interest on it.
Yep.
And so, but they did take a stake, and that was one of the scenes where I believe it was Merrill Lynch's John Thane at that point. At that point, Bank of America. But John Thane's like, so now you're going to dictate who we can compensate.
Yeah.
And there's this fire exchange between Paulson. Paulson's like, you're really going to bring up executive
Bonus
packages,
right now.
bonuses. We're going to bring up your bonus right now. But not that I thought it was tasteful. He was making a fair point, not so much about compensation, but just about the fact that the government at that point did literally have an ownership stake in our banks. And there was I would call it a soft nationalization that occurred, which was unprecedented. And I think scary for all the people in the room, and particularly for society writ large, that like, what's this world going to look like now that the government has equity stakes?
Right.
Now, I think it's all been unwound officially. The money was paid back to my knowledge. I'm going to have to verify that, but I was reading a brief article before we hit play that it was all paid back. I think there's some nuance into was all of it truly paid back.
Right.
But yeah, so it was an interesting story. We have about 5 to 10 minutes left here. We talked about the storyline, the interplay between the different key players on the inside. A name we didn't talk a ton about was Jamie Dimon. Jamie was very much at the center of a lot of these deals. I would say he was probably the ringleader or the heaviest hitter in the room, was my take from both the movie and especially the book. He was probably the most looked to, and I know that he spoke to Paulson quite frequently as having one of the healthier banks. and being in a position to actually acquire Bear Stearns,
Right.
but also being in a position where he was the first to say that they would do an equity stake or provide capitalization to Lehman Brothers before that all fell apart. I just thought it was fascinating to see the inner workings of what the government officials were thinking. Ben Bernanke was worried of the next Great Depression on steroids. Hank Paulson, we'll talk about Hank Paulson for a moment. What was interesting about Hank Paulson is, and I said this earlier, was this internal agony of what to do. And I think what was fascinating to me was he had a bit of a savior complex. Like, I know he was the Secretary of the Treasury, but he really felt it was almost his moral responsibility to save the system.
Yeah.
And I guess a rhetorical question I have is that his job?
Mm-hmm.
Like, when you're Treasury Secretary, is your job to salvage the entire history? And I think he was, like most public officials, he was deeply concerned about his legacy. And on his, because there's that scene with his wife when they're outside,
Yeah.
and he's like, if Lehman falls, and then Merrill, and then Morgan, and then Goldman, and others fall, he's like, everyday people are going to get punished. People are going to lose their homes. He saw the collateral damage that was coming. So I thought that was interesting watching the internal struggle. Now, I asked myself a really hard question. I'm curious on if you ask yourself this question. Fundamentally, by the way, I fully disagree with the bailout measures,
Right.
because I don't believe in moral hazard. And I think if we continue to play this game, we're just kicking the can down the road for financial instability. And I don't think it's fixed right now, by the way. However, if you were Hank Paulson, it's easy to be Monday morning quarterback, right? And say, I never would have done it. But I had to ask myself a tough soul-searching question. What would I have done if I knew I had the power to at least save the system this time around, with the hopes that it wouldn't happen again? Did you process that at all? Like, what would you do if you were Hank Paulson?
Yeah, I was still trying to understand Hank Paulson, and I was confused by him, but like I hadn't gotten to like what would I do, and that's kind of a terrifying question to have that many lives, at least financial lives, in your hands. And I don't know how to answer that.
I will say, to defend Paulson, and I personally would like to think I would have had the grit to allow some institutions to fail. I wish, I'd like to think that I fundamentally would have tried to do it differently and avoid government rescues, but I wasn't the guy in the moment. Nor do I think I'll ever be that guy, by the way. I'm not that arrogant. That said, let me give him a little bit of credit for a second. People were critical of him of being government Sachs, because he was the former CEO of Goldman Sachs. He was worth, I think, $600 billion, and he made a lot of his money off of these mortgage securities, right?
Yeah.
Because he was brokering them at the time.
Right.
To his credit, he really worked hard to not play favorites with Goldman Sachs. I think he did that well. And I do think in his heart of hearts, based on the book, I really think he was trying to do his best. And I think it's easy to paint somebody like him as this greedy banker who was out to hook up his friends. I don't think that was happening at all. And I think the movie portrayed him in a favorable light, that he wasn't this jerk. He really wasn't at all. I think in good faith, he was doing what we may disagree with him, but in good faith, I do think he was trying to do the right thing in his mind. And for that, that's commendable. I think he really was trying to be a public servant, even though I disagree with some of the decisions that he was making. And I've been pretty critical of Ben Bernanke's moves over the years, but I had a similar sentiment towards him. I thought he strikes me as a decent man who's trying to do the right thing in his mind and had the nation's best interest at heart. I still think the consequences are going to be severe in the long run for the actions that were taken in terms of further propagating moral hazard.
Yeah, I think that's a fair estimation, and I definitely agree with that. Your thoughts on their character, because they both definitely seemed, at least from the movie, I didn't read the book, and Paulson especially seemed very much, separated from the good old boys club, and very much like guys, the American.
He was thinking of Main Street.
Yeah,
I
totally.
really think he was the whole time. I think he was genuinely concerned about the average person.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll get lucky. I'd love to get him on the podcast.
Wow.
Yeah.
That would be...
I mean, I think he'll say no, and I don't know if I'll ever get close to the guy.
Give it a shot.
But I would
Say more
love
nice things about him. Maybe he'll.
Yeah, I was like, hey, Hank, you're a great guy, man. I would love to hear him talk about internally everything he was processing. And maybe he has some regrets now, and maybe he would have made different decisions. But I think to know the human element of Hank Paulson is important, and all of these players. And I think it's also a good reminder in our world of incivility to demonize people that we might disagree with.
Right.
And it's not leading to a fruitful dialogue, because I think there's a lot of people that we may disagree with that are doing things in good conscience and good faith, and we need to hash out these things and discuss it and think through it and agree to disagree sometimes, because this is America, and we do believe in the First Amendment, right? Any parting thoughts or things you want to convey before we wrap this episode?
Well, I think one thing from a less political and less political or theoretical perspective is the use of credit, right? Which really seems to be an accelerant in the economy at large and people's lives, generally speaking. So what I'm thinking of, for myself and for whoever's listening to this is like, what role does credit play in your financial life, in the greater financial life of the country? And, where does it make sense and where does it not make sense? Because I think that's really like been a linchpin in this whole situation, is the use of credit and the healthy use of credit, both on the part of the government and on the part of businesses.
Yeah, and you got to see the two extremes throughout the movie. The first extreme was the excessive amount of credit for people who couldn't afford mortgages.
Right.
And that was step one of the damage that led to the financial crisis. Well, maybe not step one, frankly, one of the final steps, but it was a dangerous step of too loose of credit. But then Bernanke, who is a student of the Depression, then realized, but what happens if there's too much credit or too little credit?
Right.
And
Or
the
no
whole
credit in
market
this period.
seizes,
Yeah.
businesses get shuttered, and the economy collapses, and we go into something very, very frightening that could have been worse than the Depression.
Yeah.
And so to your point, I think it's easy to say, well, credit's bad. Credit's not bad. Actually, credit, based on a historical examination, access to credit is critical to any thriving economy. And when you shutter credit, it's bad. And when you have too much of it, it's clearly deeply problematic. Final thought I have, and this is going to be a largely rhetorical one, and we need to wrap here in a couple minutes, is would it have made that big of a difference if they had let them fail? So the storyline is that if Bernanke and Paulson didn't step in to rescue the system, and Bernanke makes the point, this is going to be worse than the Great Depression. Question that I have, and I don't have a good answer for this, I really don't, is that even true? And I would love to find a scholar out there, and maybe we can find someone who could speculate about this on this podcast, is to what would have maybe truly occurred? And one thought I kept having is, are Paulson and Bernanke dramatizing the effect because they kept saying it was going to be worse than the Depression? Mm-hmm. Is that even true? They make a compelling argument that it would have occurred, but I don't know if I'm fully convinced of that argument. And I'd love to hear from scholars of like, what would have been the ramifications if we didn't allow moral hazard and we allowed some of these institutions to fail. What would the banking system look like now? Would it be better? Would it be healthier? And would it have been a depression per se?
Right. That's a great question.
Pat, thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
If you've enjoyed this content and you're looking for a wealth advisor, or if you're a financial advisor and you're looking to make the jump to the independent side, please message me on LinkedIn. Or you can email me at drew.benson@bensonwealthmgt.com. Or lastly, you can call my office at 603-316-2544. Securities offered through Raymond James Financial Services, Inc., member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services are offered through Raymond James Financial Services Advisors, Inc. Benson Wealth Management and True North Wealth Management Group are not registered broker-dealers, and they are independent of Raymond James Financial Services. The foregoing information has been obtained from sources considered to be reliable, but we do not guarantee that it is accurate or complete. It is not a statement of all available data necessary for making an investment decision, and it does not constitute a recommendation. Any opinions are those of myself and not necessarily those of Raymond James. Expressions of opinion are as of this date and are subject to change without notice. There is no guarantee that these statements, opinions, or forecasts provided herein will prove to be correct. Investing involves risks, and you may incur a profit or loss regardless of strategy selected.